recording started.
All right, thanks. Can I share my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if that works. Can you see my screen now? Okay. All right, so first I would like to say thank you to Daniel and Tilman for inviting me to this conference, for giving me the chance to share my perspective here, which is a more interpersonal or inter-individual perspective, because I'm a social psychologist. But I'm really looking forward to hearing other people's talks and also hearing your perspectives on what I have to say. And the title of my talk is Social Dilemmas in Science, but this will you will see that this is only a minor aspect of what I would like to talk about. Okay, so the landing page of this conference makes a pretty bold claim. The claim is that academia has a problem, and that the symptoms of this problem, or examples of those symptoms that are listed here, include bullying, abuse of power, corruption, fraudulent, ill-founded publications, the dominance of prestige-seeking research, and publication strategies. And indeed, there are many more examples and forms of misconduct that could be mentioned here. Broadly speaking, these examples, these different forms of misconduct, fall into two categories. And one is scientific misconduct, that is the violations of principles of good scientific practice, such as fraudulent or ill-founded publications. And then there's this other other category, and that is, I'll call that general or professional misconduct. And these are violations of professional or ethical rules, such as bullying or abuse of power. Both types of misconducts are obviously bad, but I think they should be treated separately. First, because the correlation between them seems to be not very high. Benjamin has in his talk mentioned Diederik Stapel, and some of you may know that Diederik Stapel has been portrayed as a charismatic leader with great dedication to his students and colleagues. And second, because the latter type of misconduct, the general professional misconduct, is typically perceived as more immoral because it involves direct harm to people, direct harm to colleagues, to early career researchers or team members or specific people. Whereas ill-founded publications, for example, can also do harm, but only indirectly. So in the following my talk, I will talk much more about the scientific misconduct type than about the general professional misconduct type. So let's look at scientific misconduct. Scientific misconduct is typically defined as FFP, and the FFP means fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Fabrication is making up data or results. Falsification is manipulating research materials, equipment, processes, figures in a publication or so, and changing, withholding, removing data or results without appropriate reason to do so. And plagiarism is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, materials, and so on without giving appropriate credit. So these are the three typical categories, FFP. But beyond the FFP categories, there are obviously other categories, other forms of misconduct, such as undisclosed conflicts of interest, misuse of confidential information, or claiming or withholding undue authorship. Okay, regarding the prevalence of scientific misconduct, is obviously difficult to get solid numbers because nobody wants to admit that they commit these misconducts. But there are survey studies and there are already meta-analyses. And one of the most famous meta-analysis has been published in 2009, Finelli in PLOS ONE. And in that meta-analysis, what they showed is that severe forms of questionable research practices, such as fabrication or falsification, are relatively low, at least when you look at the self-admitted numbers, at about 2%, whereas other questionable research practices, such as selective reporting, are much higher, even though they are self-admitted. So there's a social desirability bias. And even though, even with that social desirability bias, we have a prevalence rate of 34%. So this is Finelli 2009. And these findings are consistent with surveys conducted in other disciplines. The following slides, and it's a couple of slides that I'd like to show you from a German survey conducted in 2010 with more than 2,800 or so respondents, all scientists from various scientific disciplines. Now, let's first look at selective reporting, or misrepresentation of findings, what they call it. Around 35% of all respondents have at least once experienced, and here I should say that experience means committed or observed, that data were selectively reported or that data or project reports were insufficiently documented. But you can also see that that there are differences between scientific disciplines. There's a remarkable peak in the life sciences. So what these bars mean here is engineering, mathematical, geographical sciences, chemistry, physics, biological sciences, agriculture, and then medicine, it means the life sciences. WSW, SW means Wirtschaftssozialwissenschaften, economic and social sciences, and the last of the lower bar is the humanities. And you can see the stark differences between the scientific disciplines here. Fabrication or manipulation of data or results, the second F in the FFP, was comparably less prevalent, but also you can see a peak in the life sciences. Plagiarism, the third category, is also relatively prevalent. On average, around 40% of all respondents have at least once experienced, again, committed or observed, that other people's ideas were used without giving credit, other people's texts have been copied and pasted into one's own text without referencing them, or that previously published material has been published as original material in one's own text, and this is what you call self-plagiarism. Now, looking at other forms of scientific misconduct, it seems that inappropriate claiming or denying co-authorship has the highest prevalence rate, again, with a peak in the life sciences. In the 2010 German survey, on average, 55%, more than half of the respondents have at least once experienced that authorship has been unduly credited or unduly denied. And then another category, which is seldom mentioned, but is also important, and is also definitely a form of scientific misconduct, is careless assessment of other people's work. For example, in selection committees, as a reviewer of research proposals or papers, as a journal editor or so, you can be more or less diligent versus careless in assessing other people's work. And it is also quite common to observe or commit such carelessness, as you can see here with these numbers. So this survey shows that scientific misconduct is prevalent, and you might argue that the survey is from 2010, so it's relatively well aged by now. But it's still, the numbers haven't outgrown, I would say. Let me finally show you the results from a very recent survey conducted by the new Ombudsman Committee of the German Psychological Society, in which members of the German Psychological Society, DGPS, were asked about whether they had witnessed or were directly involved in scientific or general professional misconduct. And what you can see is from those who responded to the survey, which is definitely suffering from self-selection bias, but these were about 1,300 respondents in that survey, at least half had observed or were directly involved in either kind of misconduct, at least sometimes, including often and regularly. And by the way, undue authorship, claiming undue authorship was by far the most prevalent form of scientific misconduct in that survey. So to sum up, I think it's pretty clear by now, scientific misconduct is by no means a rare phenomenon committed by a small number of bad apples. Benjamin had also used this term. The vast majority of scientists is certainly playing by the rules and has never committed any of these misconduct types, but the prevalence numbers reported here still are too high to be ignored. So what are the reasons underlying them and what can we do about it? Psychologists, when talking about reasons for individual behavior, typically distinguish between person-related factors, attributes of people, of individuals, such as character traits, and situational or contextual factors, features of the situation or the context, such as norms. And Benjamin talked about that a lot, which was important. And indeed, that it seems that both categories, person-related factors and situation-related factors, play a role. In that DGPS survey that I've talked about, participants were also asked about what they thought were the most important reasons for the misconduct they experienced or witnessed. And most, as you can see here, most respondents attributed the misconduct to personality-related factors. This wasn't in the survey, that wasn't specified any further, but most likely it is a combination of high ambition and in combination with the dark triad of personality, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And then the second most highly mentioned reason for misconduct was career advancement. So again, ambition is clearly a risk factor for misconduct. There's an excellent excellent essay on scientific misconduct that was published in the Annual Review of Psychology in 2016 by Charles Gross. And in that in that essay, he was trying to portray a prototype of the culprit. And he writes, there does seem to be a model scientist whose misdeeds in science are well publicized in New York Times, Science and Nature, and in books on the subject. This scientist is a bright and ambitious young man working in an elite institution in a rapidly moving and highly competitive branch of modern biology or medicine, where results have important theoretical, clinical, or financial implications. He has been mentored and supported by a senior and respected establishment figure who is often the co-author on many of his papers, but may have not been closely involved in the research. And when we think of the most famous and the most shocking cases of fraud in psychology, the prototype described by Gross here seems to ring a bell. What is interesting and what is strange, at least on first glance, is that scientific misconduct seems to occur in context and under circumstances that one would consider favorable per se. Elite institutions, good mentors, great support facilities, a solid intellectual basis. So one wonders why misconduct occurs when the starting conditions are so optimal that fraud isn't needed. It's not, you don't need to be fraudulent in order to be successful. You are already successful. And one explanation why that's the case is that the norm to excel, Benjamin talked about this too, is particularly salient in these contexts, in elite institutions. The pressure to perform is particularly high. In Germany, we have an advisory board for the federal government, and it's the advisory board on science and humanities. It's called the Wissenschaftsrat, and they have a paper in 2011 where they talk about misconduct in science. And here, the Wissenschaftsrat writes, many believe that these practices, and I'm talking about scientific misconduct here, have grown significantly, and they're talking about the German system, right? As a function of time and competitive pressure due to evaluation and governance systems. It stands to reason that research imminent high expectations regarding quality and originality in combination with high time pressure advance such misconduct. In addition, an increasing degree of competitiveness in an international scientific landscape in which more and more researchers within and beyond Germany compete about reputation and employment opportunities may be a reason for such misconduct. So they talk about an increase. And the question is, where does that increase come from? What has increased and what are the governance, where's the word? The governance systems that they are talking about. What are they talking about here? And to answer this question, let me give you a little bit of background on the German academic system, or the history of German academic system. The system underwent a drastic change during the 1990s. This change in the academic system was in fact part of a much larger change in public administration. It was the era of new public management or new public government and reforms that you would call neoliberal today. It started in the United Kingdom, United States, but then swept over to Europe and first the Netherlands and then Germany too. And it was a time in which both the federal government as well as the state governments who are responsible for universities, but also the general public in Germany became more and more dissatisfied, unhappy with their science system, with their universities. Students were dissatisfied with the teaching quality. Professors were dissatisfied with the large number of long-term students, lazy students. University administrations were dissatisfied with the fact that they could not make strategic decisions on their own, but they had to feed back each and every decision, including each hiring decision on the professorship level with their federal ministries of education. So the state grip was pretty tight in before and beginning of the 1990s. And the federal ministries, the state, was unhappy with the fact that Germany's visibility on the global science market has remained far below expectations, although millions of D-marks had been pumped into the university system since 1960. In addition, since it was the 1990s, there was German reunification and an alarmingly amount of brain drain, famous German scientists leaving academia and moving to elite universities in the UK or US. So it was considered a crisis. And the solution to that crisis was to loosen the state grip and to grant more decision autonomy to the universities. The states declared the university responsible for improvements regarding efficient processes and competitive records and visibility and productivity. And in exchange, they would loosen their grip. And this is new public government. And the new public government in academia means that scarce public resources, taxpayers' money, should be allocated on the basis of a fair process, as fair as possible, accountable, transparent. The idea of new public government is productivity can be objectively evaluated and should be incentivized and rewarded. And by contrast, laziness should be punished. The assumption is that competition, social comparison, has a motivating effect on individual researchers. And the idea is that universities should become more efficient, more autonomous, and more transparent. The counter model, the opposite model to new public management, has in that paper by the Wissenschaftsrat been called the Humboldtian ideal model. And the Humboldtian ideal model assumes that researchers need two things. They need freedom and independence. These are the two basic things that a researcher needs in order to excel. They need freedom and independence instead of surveillance or external control. The Humboldtian ideal also assumes that trust, autonomy, and intrinsic motivation are key to scientific achievement and success. It also assumes that extrinsic incentives undermine intrinsic motivation. And also following from that, extrinsic incentives will always favor quantity over quality, mainstream science over daring science, homogeneity over diversity, bureaucracy over creativity, and so on. I should add that the academic system in Germany was never fully Humboldtian. It had never been fully Humboldtian. And right now, it's also totally not fully neoliberal. It's somewhere in between. But if you think of these two models as endpoints on a continuum, there was a shift from the Humboldtian to the new public government in the 1990s. And the point that I'd like to make here is that both models have their pros and their cons. For example, new public government or new public management, there's a point to the idea that scarce resources should be allocated on the basis of an equity rule. I studied in the 1990s, and the psychology department at my university back then consisted of professors that spanned the entire range of productivity, from really immense productivity and visibility to shocking laziness. I did have professors who did not care to write anything except for maybe 1 or 2 chapters in a German handbook per year. And then later, when I was an associate professor, I used to work in a department where one of my colleagues literally took pride in sitting in an armchair and reading books all day, not publishing a single paper, not applying for a single research project. I'm not a neoliberal, really not, but that did leave me, to be honest, with mixed feelings. I wondered whether it was fair that my colleague could do whatever she wanted in her armchair when my tenure as a junior professor was being assessed on the basis of my publication record. And that had it left me with mixed feelings, let me put it like that. So the question is, what system do we want? The new public management system maybe comes with more transparency, independence, and efficiency, but at the cost of more bureaucracy and evaluation. If it's government by numbers, somebody has to collect those numbers, right? And the Humboldtian ideal sounds great. Allocation of resources based on equality and need, and freedom and autonomy. It sounds so great, a nurturing state. But then again, it comes at the cost of productivity and competitiveness, at the cost of transparency and control, and at the cost of efficiency and accountability. So each of these models has their pros and cons. And my impression is that we live in a time in which neoliberal thinking is frowned upon much more than it used to be in the 1990s. And that certainly the people who argue for less neoliberal systems, they certainly have their point, but you always should be aware that there are costs if you switch from one model to the other. The question may also be, is there a best of both worlds? Is there a system that allows individual autonomy and freedom, but also accountability? Is there a system that creates a trust climate, but also sanctions exploitation of that trust, and so on? I don't know, but to be honest, I don't think that there is a best of both worlds. You can't have, this is a typical case in my view of a cake that you cannot have and eat at the same time. I just don't think that exists. Okay, so let me come back to the scientific misconduct issue and what we can do about it. The German Psychological Society, the DGPS, has recently launched a discussion forum on its website titled Integrity and Incentive Systems in Science, and it has invited all of its members to contribute their opinions and perspectives on this topic. The report from the Ombudsman Committee that I showed you earlier and the survey results reported there served as a starting point on that website. And then there's a first contribution, or the first contribution that appeared is from Daniel Leising, who also organizes this conference, and Maya Tesmuchadze, Felix Schönbrot, and Stefan Scherbaum. And this is unfortunately, it's just in German, but it's for the German community. And the title of their contribution is unethisches Verhalten in der Wissenschaft ein systemisches Problem? Is it a systemic problem? And let me quote from their contribution. In their paper, Leising et al. Identified 3 problems or risk factors for misconduct. That is an inappropriate power differential, faulty incentive structures, and a lack of control and sanctioning mechanisms. So from that, they follow that there should be a drastic reduction of power imbalances between professors and early career researchers. There should be fundamental changes in the incentive system. For example, the weight of quantitative indicators should be drastically reduced, and alternative indicators should be developed and used, such as the Hong Kong principles, and we will hear more about this in other talks. And the third proposition, the third remedy they propose is the establishment of control and sanctioning systems. So they argue that there should be more external control, such as a publicly funded integrity office that could be located, for example, at the German Research Foundation, and that also has the right to make unannounced audits on labs or institutions. That's what they write. And this integrity office should also have the right to impose severe sanctions in cases of scientific misconduct. And in my opinion, many of what they write makes sense. Many of these proposed solutions go exactly in the right direction. And I particularly like the author's idea of drastically downsizing the use of a small number of quantitative indicators, such as the Hirsch index, the impact factor, citation counts, and so on. What I would like to challenge, though, is the last of the 3 proposed remedies, the establishment of tighter control and harsher sanctioning systems. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing for letting culprits get away with their fraudulent behavior. On the contrary, I really think that misconduct must and should be sanctioned. But what I'm arguing is that increasing tightness and harshening sanctions also, it's a system and it comes at a cost. And it's important to ask whether we actually want to pay these costs. Social psychology, my discipline, and behavioral economics know a lot about sanctioning systems and how they work and when they work and how they guide individual behavior. And I would just like to share 2 research findings from the literature with you that I think are illustrative and telling for the discussion we should have. And the first comes from a Japanese researcher, the late Toshio Yamagishi, who had studied the effect of sanctioning systems and interpersonal trust on cooperation in different cultures, mostly the United States and Japan. You may know that Japan is often said to be a prototypically collectivistic culture, where the USA is often portrayed to be a prototypically individualistic culture. Now, Yamagishi argues that this does not at all imply that Japanese people trust each other more than Americans. On the contrary, there are many survey studies showing that Americans trust their fellows more than Japanese, at least when social control and sanctioning systems are absent. Now, Yamagishi argues that this is because Japan entertains a system of high social control, especially in committed social relationships. And this is a system that creates a sense of knowledge, or he calls it assurance, but it does not create a system of trust. So a basic argument, and I could talk much more about this, but in a nutshell, the idea is that in the US, we have a comparably higher social uncertainty, and uncertainty is the basis on which a culture of trust can evolve. Whereas in a system of high social control, trust cannot evolve because there's no room for it to evolve. What social control does, it creates a culture of assurance, and assurance is based on the knowledge of incentive structures, whereas trust is based on the inference of the interaction partner's personal traits and intentions when you don't know how he or she will behave. So therefore, in a system marked by strong social control, such as Japan, cooperation is more likely to break down in the absence of a sanctioning system, when people feel unobserved, because there's no assurance anymore. And in a system marked by trust, on the other hand, cooperation is less likely to break down even in the absence of a sanctioning system. And here's just one example. I don't want to go into details, but basically what this particular study shows is that you can increase cooperation among people. Here this in a social dilemma. I think it was a public goods dilemma. So they measure individual contributions to public goods. And under a sanctioning system, cooperation rates in the public good were generally high. But as soon as the sanctioning system was absent, as soon as participants in this study felt unobserved, cooperation broke down, and it particularly broke down in Japan among Japanese participants, because as Yamagishi argues, they have a culture of assurance where cooperation is more likely to break down in the absence of social control. Just as an anecdote, Yamagishi even goes so far as to say that collectivist society produces security but destroys trust. But I just wanted to share this with you because I find it so fascinating. But the point is, social control can undermine trust. And the second research finding that I'd like to share comes from a research program by Michelle Gelfand from the US and her colleagues, who studied cultures and society marked by strong social control and sanctioning systems. They call them tight cultures versus those cultures marked by relatively fewer social control systems and a greater tolerance for deviance. They call them loose cultures. And cultural tightness is positively related to perceived situational constraints, higher dutifulness, greater self-regulation strength, a higher need for structure, higher self-monitoring, greater conscientiousness, and greater cautiousness. So people play by the rules more in a tight culture, which is probably not surprising. But the point I would like to make here is that Gelfand also finds that a tight culture produces on the individual level, lower openness, lower levels of creativity, lower happiness. a stronger traditional commitment to a stronger commitment to traditional social roles, lower levels of diversity, and more discrimination. And I know I may be exaggerating here, and some of you may now roll their eyes and sigh and say, yeah, we don't want to install a Stasi system in science. I know, but I'm just saying, what kind of system do we actually want? The point I would really like to make here is that we need to be careful when calling for sanctioning systems and other types of extrinsic reward and punishment systems, because intrinsic rewards can undermine trust, and we need trust in the scientific system. But I think so. My perspective, what I think is most important in order to reduce and prevent misconduct in science is not new. It has also already been proposed by Charles Gross in an essay that I mentioned, and by Wolfgang Ströbe in an essay from 2012. And they basically, they write, they talk about 3 remedies. And one remedy is, number 1 is make misconduct detectable, but without creating a culture of distrust. Both anecdotal and systematic empirical evidence very clearly shows the importance of whistleblowing to detect fraud and misconduct cases. For instance, in Ströbe et al.'s collection of, I think they described 40 cases of misconduct in science between 1974 and 2012, all in a variety of sciences. Half of these cases, 21, were detected after team members or colleagues reported to an ombudsman, to the dean, or some other institution in charge. So the systemic challenge is to create a system in which whistleblowers are protected and encouraged to report misconduct, while really at the same time avoiding the creation of a culture of distrust and the danger of false accusations. And Ströbe et al. Suggest 3 ways to do it. The first is raising institutional awareness. The second is implementing explicit organizational guidelines. And the third is making confirmed, really securely confirmed cases of misconduct public. Especially the first 2 aspects are extremely important in my view. In this vein, the German Research Foundation, the DFG, has reworked its code of conduct some years ago, and it now obliges all universities and research institutions who are members of the DFG in Germany to implement its 19 guidelines for safeguarding good scientific practice. And here's the link, so if you want to look that up, you can do so. The DFG also maintains a national ombudsman committee that advises individual researchers and institutions. It offers courses and materials, and it serves as a contact point for individuals who wish to file a report on scientific misconduct. I'm a member of the Senate Committee of the DFG for the research training groups, die Graduiertenkollegs, and I can tell you this plays a really important role. It is now mandatory to organize courses on good scientific practice for doctoral candidates in any of these research training groups. And I think that's the right step. Second, increase openness and transparency. Openness and transparency regarding materials, data, hypotheses, analysis plans, and so on, as proposed by the open science movement, and as well as acknowledged by scientific organizations, journals. Sorry, can you still hear me? Because I just got a message.
Yeah, we hear you again. I'm sorry, I think that was something with the technique.
Okay, all right. So increasing openness and transparency may decrease the prevalence of fabrication and falsification, or at least make it more, make it harder, make it more difficult. But what I think is important here, that open science, openness and transparency acknowledges, any of these reforms acknowledges the dilemmas that come with it. And the dilemmas are, first, the dilemma between free access to research outputs for the public on the one hand, and property rights and data protection issues, such as outlines, for example, in the General Data Protection Regulation, on the other hand. The second dilemma to keep in mind is Well, collecting and documenting original data and sharing data takes an amount of time that needs to be acknowledged, whereas reusing shared data involves an amount of time that is probably just a part of that time investment. So we need an acknowledgement of the time it takes to share your data and your materials and to document this properly. And the third dilemma is a dilemma between transparency for the sake of error detection on the one hand, and authors' worries, their concerns that their work might be flagged and their reputation being damaged on the other hand. Some of you may say that reputation damage is a small price to pay for a reliable fraud detecting system. And that may be right, but surveys show that worries about being scooped and worries about being denounced by others, academic competitors, for example, are important predictors of scientists' hesitance to share their data. For instance, in a survey we conducted some years ago, researchers' worries about the career disadvantages of sharing your data were particularly prevalent among early career researchers, not so much about among tenured professors, but much more about among early career researchers. And this dilemma, this particular dilemma, shows very clearly in my view that trust is such an important aspect in academia. Let me advertise one of the upcoming papers on pro-sociality in science that I was involved in. I'm saying this to get my citation numbers up, of course. But the idea is that the willingness to make oneself vulnerable, and this is what you do when you share your data. You make yourself vulnerable in order to maximize collective outcomes, is crucial for solving the many social dilemmas that scientists face in their daily work routines. I really believe that we need a trust system in science. And in that regard, let me also mention that I think it is important to understand how much damage has been and is still being done by some individuals acting like the academic conduct police, publishing ranking lists of scientists according to their alleged replicability or robustness or whatever, or posting ad hominem attacks on social media, rather than engaging in a constructive solution-oriented discussion with authors whose results they want to challenge. In psychology in Germany, we recently, or last year, we issued recommendations on data sharing in psychology, and our idea to solve some of the dilemmas I was talking about was to give researchers the opportunity to choose an access category from very, very open to very restrictive. And it depends, it's the researcher's individual discretion to choose one of these access categories. And the idea is that this provides a researcher with the freedom to choose and to give them to reduce their worries that they might be scooped or that they may come in contact with GDPR regulations and so on. And the third remedy I would like to propose is we need to improve hiring decisions on all levels, especially professor positions. We really need to talk about the issue of personnel selection and hiring procedures in universities. In psychology, Andrea Able-Brehm, the former president of the DGPS, had started a discussion a couple of years ago with a survey among DGPS members who had served on hiring committees, who were experienced in hiring procedures. And they documented very clearly that the ought and the is of hiring procedures are very, very disparate. What they did is they asked participants which of a list of criteria should be important in personnel selection on a professorship level. And for example, many respondents think that strategic thinking skills, the applicant's willingness to promote early career researchers, organizational and management skills, research transparency commitment, and leadership competence should play a much larger role in the process. These are the green bars that you can see here. But the same respondents also reported that in the last hiring procedure they were involved in, each of these criteria, each of these selection categories played a much minor role. So there's a large gap between the is and the ought. There are many reasons for this. In my experience, it is the hiring committee's fear of doing something wrong. You call it the prevention focus. That is important to mention here. For example, in Germany, hiring committees consist of people who lack the specific expertise in areas in which they want to hire somebody. And we have very strict regulations regarding conflicts of interest and potential biases in hiring committees. Even the slightest, I mean, at least at the university I am now, even the slightest semblance, even the slightest indicator of potential bias and conflicts of interest leads to the consequence that a hiring committee member is being discharged. And this leaves committees with people who have no expertise, or let's say no expertise, but little expertise in that particular area of research in which they want to hire somebody. Plus, hiring processes are dominated by university administration's fear of legal action taken by competitors who have not been selected. So in order to give the hiring process an allegedly objective makeup, quantitative indicators such as the number of publications, the number of citations, the amount of funded projects still dominate the list of selection criteria. And it's still, when you talk to people at conferences like this one, everybody agrees, yeah, there should be these quantitative indicators, the Hirsch index, there should be much less important. But if you are sitting on a hiring committee, even now, it is the most important selection criteria that's being applied. And this needs to change. We certainly don't need more quantitative indicators or weighing factors or bonus points or something. What we need are state-of-the-art procedures for selecting the best, that is the most clever, the most skilled, the most creative, the most agreeable, and the most socially competent colleague we can think of. And to do so, we need more time, we need better indicators, and we need a clear, and we need less prevention focusedness in hiring committees. All right, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your contributions and questions.